Hello. Today, I want to share with you some of my findings based on research I've done on an emerging unity of thought on ennobling leadership. These findings are pretty exciting to me, and I hope that you will enjoy these reflections. I'm going to start by sharing my slides with you. All right. There is no doubt that we live in an age of transition marked by great ferment. The twin processes of integration and disintegration with which we've become intimately familiar are rapidly accelerating, wreaking havoc and creating turbulence on an unprecedented scale. Yet we don't despair because we believe that both processes have a single goal, which is to sweep away the barriers that keep humanity from unifying. In one of his tablets, Abdu'l-Baha assures us that unity is within our reach. Moreover, he has identified some lights that we are to look for that will mark the path to this unity. He calls these the seven candles of unity. Our focus today will rest on the second candle, which is unity of thought and world undertakings, as it relates specifically to the sphere of power and leadership. Now, it's evident to every discerning observer that our prevailing conceptions of power and leadership are bankrupt. In its 2019 message to the world, the Universal House of Justice acknowledged that achieving peace would require a Herculean feat of statesmanship, which was currently lacking. Just over a year later, the House of Justice, in its Resvan 2020 message, observed that prominent thinkers and commentators and leaders were coming to a greater insight and that they were beginning to explore fundamental concepts and bold assumptions and aspirations that had largely been absent from public discourses. They expressed their hope that these glimmerings would hold out the possibility that a moment of collective consciousness may be in view. So this is a very exciting vision. I believe that we're starting to see glimmerings of this new thinking and an emerging unity of thought regarding the need for and requirements of a new and ennobling form of leadership. What I find particularly exciting is that this new thinking seems to converge with the writings of the faith and the experience that the faith has to offer. So let's start taking a look. I think we should begin by highlighting three salient features of our old conception of power and role of leadership in order to see the path that we seem to be pursuing to emerge from this. The first salient feature is the idea that those in power seek to dominate and control us and to appropriate our precious resources for their own selfish desires. The second is that those in authority are driven primarily by ego and motivated by self-interest. And the third is that those in authority somehow possess a higher status or station than the rest of us, that somehow they're superior to us. Now, one of the most unfortunate consequences of holding on to these beliefs has been that we've been engaging in the self-defeating behavior of electing unfit leaders. Given our views, we tend to be ambivalent about elections, we sit them out, we create a vacuum, and then we gripe and are disillusioned when the results come in. We also tend to set very low standards for our leaders, teachers, leaders. And we tend to elect unfit ones because we just assume that nothing's ever going to change. We're just going to get what we've always gotten. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We end up with leaders who are incapable of meeting either the needs or challenges of the day. They're unwilling to be truthful and transparent about the dangers, opportunities, and potential courses of action before us. And they're certainly incapable of forging a unity of vision around shared values, followed by a unity of action in creating systems effective to do things like combat the global challenge of climate change. So the next step now, and this is the exciting part, so we know what the old thinking and the old results were like, is to look at what the new emerging conceptions of power, authority, and leadership are, and how they converge with the Baha'i perspective. I want to share with you this image, first of all, to inspire you. This is one of the caves that exists in Bermuda. It's been in existence for over 1 million years. You see these stalactites and stalagmites, one coming from the top, one from the bottom, and they grow at a very slow pace, but eventually they will converge. This, to me, this picture captures the twin processes of integration and disintegration, but also the convergence of thinking in the outside world when that thinking starts to converge with divine revelation, with what Baha'u'llah has already told us is going to happen. And I find this process exciting and inspiring. So let's keep this image in mind as we move forward. So the first aspect of this emerging new thinking is a new articulation of the very purpose and power and role of leadership. Purpose of power and the role of leadership. Now, in the Baha'i view, power and authority are simply necessary elements of an organized society. Their role is simply to create the necessary conditions that allow each of us to actualize our potential and live lives of meaning, grounded in justice and righteousness. Now, this jives with the new thinking. For instance, as we read about it in the works of Doris Kearns Goodwin, who is an academic, historian, and author. In her book, Leadership in Turbulent Times, she says that one of the great hallmarks of great leadership is to call for fundamental fairness, a square deal for all, the right of all to rise to the level of their talent and discipline, and to forge a middle path between extremes. So you see how well it aligns with the Baha'i vision. The Universal House of Justice has told us that we need to learn to associate words such as release, encourage, channel, guide, and enable with the idea of power. And they, moreover, have said that this power is not a finite entity that is to be seized and jealously guarded. Rather, it constitutes a limitless capacity to transform that resides in the human race as a body. This is in the House's 2013 message to the Baha'is of Iran. This view aligns very well and is in harmony with something that an American entrepreneur, author, and motivational speaker, Jim Rohn, said. He defined leadership as the ability to help others change their thoughts, beliefs, and actions for the better. The second feature of this new emerging idea of the purpose of power and the role of leadership is that a fit leader is capable of forging unity of thought and action. Abdu'l-Baha talks about this a lot in The Secret of Divine Civilization, in which he says that we must have a unified public opinion. He said that the deficiencies in Iranian society at the time he was writing this work had resulted from the total absence of such a unified public opinion. And he warned that the country could not be properly administered until people were educated and until public opinion was rightly focused. Now, let's compare this with what Ken Blanchard, a US business consultant, author, and motivational speaker, has said. He says the greatest leaders mobilize others by coalescing people around a shared vision. So, this is the focusing basically of public opinion. Essentially, when we think about this as Baha'is, this is what the Universal House of Justice does with the plans it creates for the Baha'i world, right? It forges a unity of vision and then rallies the believers to take unified action in support of those plans. Now, Abraham Lincoln famously said that public sentiment, so again, we're back to public opinion, is everything. He said, with it, nothing can fail, and against it, nothing can succeed. Arnold Toynbee, the famous historian of the 20th century, in his book, Changing Habits, talks about the importance of forging a unity of vision. And he said it begins by forging a common understanding of values and adopting shared values, especially on moral issues. He said it was particularly important to gain clarity on the difference between right and wrong as an indispensable foundation for harmonizing various social and cultural heritages, which he said was a necessary foundation for creating a new civilization. If we're not yet convinced, the American political scientist and emeritus professor at Harvard, Robert Putnam, in his book Upswing, says that to become a more progressive society, our leaders must have their consciences stirred first in order to achieve moral clarity, and that only once that happens can one create the culture that provides the conditions for a more progressive society. And this is based on empirical evidence of what happened in the United States in our transition from the Gilded Age at the beginning of the 20th century to the Progressive Age. And that this jives again with what Shoghi Effendi tells us is one of the purposes of the processes of disintegration that we're seeing. The purpose of suffering is to stir the conscience, disillusion the masses, so that we will become willing to radically reconceptualize the way we view society. So we're really seeing a convergence of this new thinking in the outside world with the thinking that already exists in the Baha'i writing. All right. The next aspect of a new form of ennobling leadership is that ennobling leadership is about the duty and privilege of service versus self-aggrandizement. Again, in The Secret of Divine Civilization, Abdu'l-Baha says that leaders should not be motivated by money, status, influence, or power, but by the determination to achieve universal good. Andre Malraux, who was information minister and later culture minister in France and was also a novelist and art theorist, said this: to command is to serve, nothing more and nothing less. So again, we see the congruence, alignment of these visions. Indeed, Abdu'l-Baha himself said that the highest station was the station of certitude, which is why he chose for himself the appellation servant of Baha. One can really best understand this notion by thinking of the analogy of a waterfall. Despite all the sound and fury and drama of the water at the top of the waterfall and halfway down, real power in the waterfall resides at the bottom in the reservoir, where the water accumulates, is calm, and provides a life-giving source to humanity. Okay, next aspect of a new ennobling leadership is learning to distinguish between rank and station. This is key, and it's an important topic for us Baha'is also to consider even within the Baha'i community. Leaders merely fulfill a function for which they happen to be suited during a particular time of need. That's it. That is the Baha'i concept of leadership. It is not about according people high stations and worshiping them or creating this notion of status and that somebody is higher or lower than somebody else. The analogy that applies here is that of an army. As Abdu'l-Baha says, not everyone can be a general and not everyone can be a soldier. The army needs both. Each has a function to fulfill and the skills suited to the job. The important point is to recognize that this is not a reflection of their intrinsic worth as human beings, nor does it reflect their spiritual station. It certainly doesn't mean that one is better than the other. This is a really deep point that we all need to imbibe and, forge it into our DNA to understand so that our behavior will change. The next hallmark of a worthy leader is someone who can take the long view, be proactive, and act on principle rather than expediency or short-termism. Baha'u'llah begins by setting the standard and telling us all that we must always see the end in the beginning. Now let's look at what some other thinkers say. Arnold Glasow, who was an American businessman and humorist, said that one of the tests of leadership is the ability to recognize a problem before it becomes an emergency. Oh, that our current leaders had this particular trait of character, had not waited for climate change and nuclear proliferation and genocides and the continuation of war to become endemic problems that we now have to deal with massive exertion of effort. Kishore Mahbubani, Singaporean diplomat and geopolitical consultant, and he has many titles, I won't go into all of them, but he avers that a good leader must plan for the worst case scenarios versus the best case ones, and must be clear-eyed about the possibilities and make plans to deal with them before disaster strikes. One of the features of taking a long view in making decisions is to identify a set of principles first and use those in order to make decisions. This is a principle and an approach that the Universal House of Justice articulated in its peace message of 1985, saying that world leaders would do well before they tried to solve problems by first identifying the principles involved and then applying them. Now, compare this with what Henry Kissinger says in his book on leadership. He points to Chancellor Adenauer of Germany and President de Gaulle of France. And he says that they both demonstrated that it is better not to bargain away guiding principles for short-term gain and political expediency. And it was because both of them were untainted by compromises that when they eventually came back and were able to govern, they emerged stronger and morally untainted, thereby magnifying the legitimacy of their power. So these are historical examples that really bear investigating. Next feature of a good leader. A good leader is someone who can accept reality as it is and yet imagine and envision a better reality. In other words, they have the creativity and imagination to envision a better reality. Being clear-eyed means seeing reality as it is, not worse than it is, and not wishing it were better. Doris Goodwin says, especially in times of crisis, a great leader can strike the balance between realism and optimism, addressing brutal realities while still expressing hope for the future. Kissinger similarly says that great leaders have a penetrating understanding of realities as they exist, yet they possess a vision to change the reality. Now, one of the, I think, very interesting thinkers of the time to watch is Stephen Hines, President and CEO of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. He gives a good example. He says the creation of the UN was an act of imagination and free will. However, the world missed the opportunity after the Cold War in 1991 through what he sees as a failure of creativity. He then posits that with the turbulence that's going on in the world today, we have another opportunity to build an international system for the future, and that we must do this by co-creating the international framework of the future. The House of Justice talked about this in its 2019 message that humanity kept missing the boat, including after the Cold War, and they put it down also to certain weaknesses that we have that keep getting in our way of reaching for a lasting peace. Now, let's look at some examples of this kind of leadership within the Baha'i community. Remember, I said that these emerging concepts of unity of thought on an ennobling leadership converge not only with the Baha'i writings, but with our experience. So let's look at what Abdu'l-Baha, our perfect exemplar, did. Starting in 1912, he initiated farming efforts in the villages in Jordan, including Arasiya, Nuqayb, and Samra. He instructed the believers there in how they should grow corn and store them in pits. These provisions ended up saving the lives of countless inhabitants of Haifa and Akka during the years of the blockade during the First World War. In recognition of his efforts, he was awarded a knighthood, as we know, in 1920. at the residence of the British governor in Haifa. So this is one example of leadership, seeing the end in the beginning, being proactive, having taking the long view, being creative, being imaginative, and actually then taking action. Another example was when Abdu'l-Baha asking Susan Moody to go to Iran and establish both a medical center and schools to meet the crying needs of the women and girls of Tehran. And this is explored very well in great detail in Dr. Mahmoudi's book. Third example is one in the outside world of this. This is an example of the dual trait of leadership in the realm of political institution building, governance, and peace. And we can see this in Jean Monnet's call for the pooling of coal and steel resources of several European countries in the aftermath of the Second World War, pooling them in the hands of a supranational European coal and steel community, a completely novel concept, which became this community basically did two things. It became the foundation of what we know today as the European Union. It brought unity to the nations in Western Europe, and it became the cause of a permanent peace in Western Europe. So it's really a phenomenal story. I've written a couple of books on it. You can ask me about it later if you're interested. All right, next thing. An effective leader, another feature of an effective leader, is someone who can take people where they don't necessarily want to go but ought to be. This is a famous statement from Rosalind Carter. So, apropos of the same, Abdu'l-Baha says public opinion must be directed toward whatever is worthy of this day. And it's impossible to do this, he said, except through the use of adequate arguments and the addressing of clear, comprehensive, and conclusive proofs. Um, he says, because the helpless masses are really ignorant, and that ignorance is like a veil that shuts them away. So it's the job of the leaders is to convince them and bring them along, even though they may not want to go there. We see this today, the absence of it everywhere in the world. We have to find timely solutions to global challenges. Again, I know I keep repeating climate change, elimination of nuclear weapons, and the establishment of a global system of collective security. And yet our leaders are not yet rising to that level of Herculean feats of statesmanship. So Doris Kearns Goodwin, speaking to this same point, says that one must never underestimate the power of individual persuasion, and a good leader must not underestimate it. Speaking to the same point, Henry Kissinger says that the 6 leaders he discusses in his book, Leadership, envisioned a future that others couldn't, and they were able to design and implement concrete steps to bring it about after, and this is the key point, after having to overcome recalcitrant countrymen and special interests and naysayers. So this is the skill that our leaders need. In other words, leaders need to be able to hold a vision for their people of what's possible and then nudge them along and guide them slowly to actualizing it. So this is what Kissinger calls not shying away from confrontation, but understanding how to cajole and lead their people so that in a seemingly impossible future can both be better imagined and realized. So I'd like to pause here for a moment and consider one of the interesting new thinkers whom I mentioned before, Stephen Hines, who I believe embodies the traits that we've been talking about, being able to see the long view, taking proactive steps based on principle and proposing solutions, and providing adequate arguments to get us to be persuaded, right? To persuade us. So I want to just share a couple of his ideas very quickly, and then we'll learn about some more later in this presentation. He says that the age of turbulence and the challenges of the 21st century demand a new, more equitable distribution of power. So he says we need new international or planetary bodies responsible for managing planetary challenges. Now, compare this with what the Baha'i writings say. They provide us with a blueprint to accomplish this, including the need for the creation of a world parliament, a world executive, and a massively reformed world court. He also proposes that individual nations give up their militaries and plow that money into improving the lives of others. Again, the Baha'i view is very much in alignment that war should be eliminated as an instrument of international relations and that each nation's armaments be reduced to the amount necessary to maintain order within their borders and then to create a system of collective security, kind of all for one and one for all, with an international standing force to keep the peace in the world. Heinz also says it's time to reimagine democracy. He says it's flawed and needs to be made more inclusive, more fully representative, more participatory, and more effective. Again, this aligns with the statements Abdu'l-Baha has made about the importance of a parliamentary democracy and the importance of consultation as a tool to use in arriving at decisions in governance and elsewhere in life. Okay, so let's keep going with the features of this new ennobling sense of leadership. A fit leader sees opportunities in challenges. It's very similar to the notion that we have in the writings that the world is in a state of pregnancy, according to Baha'u'llah, and will soon yield its noblest fruits. So while we're going through the excruciating labor pains, we know that a better thing is coming. So the old order is dying, making way for a new one to be born. Interestingly, Steve Hines says that as well. He says the current challenges represent grave challenges for old assumptions and existing frameworks. He says the old order is dying and a new order is demanding to be born. So really fascinating and very exciting. This convergence is, again, the stalactites and the stalagmites working towards each other. Another feature of a fit leader is that they recognize the principle of oneness as the pivotal principle of international life, or as the Guardian puts it, as the ruling principle of international life. And the way that it translates in their action is that they end up working, leaders do, to promote broad collective interests versus narrow self-interests or the interests of special groups, which is really the way our world functions today. So humanity has to recognize that we become a single organism. It's interesting in the tablet to Queen Victoria, Baha'u'llah even urges the members of the British Parliament when taking decisions to take into account the collective interests of humanity. I've always found that so fascinating. And again, when we look at things like climate change, nuclear proliferation, you have to, any decisions you make on like the kinds of energy you use and the amounts will have an impact on the whole world. And we all know that we sink or swim together. There's a lot about oneness in the writings, and I don't want to belabor the point. You're all very well aware of what has been said. What I found very interesting was that in one of its recent messages, the House of Justice said that the global challenges that humanity was now facing were a severe test of its willingness to put aside short-term self-interest and to come to terms with the stark spiritual and moral reality that there's but one interconnected human family and it shares one precious homeland. Now, this again aligns completely with something Stephen Hines says. He says that Americans and other nations must pursue national interests with an understanding that in an interdependent world, our well-being is directly tied to peaceful and prosperous conditions elsewhere and to the fate of the planet. And he says it is time for a new vision of America's role in the world based on an understanding that what is good for the world is good for us here in the United States. Again, fascinating. The last feature I want to highlight is that a worthy leader ensures that the means employed are always as worthy as the ends. Now, once we'll talk about this more later. Once we've established this new way of thinking, it will lead to new behavior, which is an election of fit leaders. Because once we've reframed our concepts of the true purpose of power and the role of leadership, we'll begin to demand that our leaders possess certain qualities of characters. Instead of focusing on policies and platforms, we focus on character and competence first. Otherwise, it's putting the cart before the horse. I have always found this statement by Abe Lincoln very edifying. He says, I never had a policy. I've just tried to do my best each and every day. And that's how he even eventually ended up changing his views on the scourge of slavery and was willing to basically bring about the emancipation of slaves in the United States because he had the strength of character to see with his own eyes, be persuaded, and make changes, as opposed to stick to a platform or policy. Honestly, despite promises made, also, we all know that reality kicks in, as a famous former British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, said when he was asked what was likely to throw a government off course. He said, "Events, dear boy, events," which is very true. So let's examine some of the key qualities we have to demand of our leaders. Now, I want to focus on the ones with the asterisk at the bottom of the list you see, but highlight the importance of honesty. Abdu'l-Baha talks about it in Secret of Divine Civilization. It's absolutely key. Thinkers like Doris Kearns Goodwin says that the great presidents of this country possessed a stellar character and moral fiber. So I don't want to belabor the point. The second is freedom from prejudice. Very important. A person being considered for post should not stoke the fires of hatred and prejudice, but rather be a unifier. Abdu'l-Baha makes a comment. He says, often a leader will, to maintain his own leadership, will everlastingly direct the masses toward that prejudice and fanaticism which subvert the very purpose, the very base of civilization. And it's so true. We see this playing out everywhere in the world. Courage. Leaders must be willing to say things even though they're unpopular, take citizens into their confidence, be transparent with them about the difficulties and about the difficult solutions. They've got to stop infantilizing their citizenry and not worry about whether they're going to get reelected. As Jean-Claude Juncker, former Prime Minister of Luxembourg and former President of the European Commission, famously said, we all know what to do, but we don't know how to get elected once we do it, which is why they don't do the right thing. Kishore Mahbubani gives us an example in the context of the reaction of European leaders to the war in Ukraine. He says that they failed to confront their populations with the very hard choices, which is stand up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine by making sacrifice like cuts in entitlements, raising taxes, and conscription, or else compromise with Russia and keep your lifestyle. So he says this level of honesty, the courage to tell the truth as it is lacking. Interesting viewpoint. The next is freedom from corruption. Abdu'l-Baha says it's critical that leaders and assemblies of consultation remain free from its taint. And there's a lot to be said about it. He says they have to be content with their lawful emoluments and not seek additional funds. They shouldn't be trying to amass riches and make themselves wealthier. And so he redefines, in some sense, the concept of wealth for us by saying that the true wealth is the good, serving the good of the collective good. A lot has been written about the effects of corruption. I would point you particularly to Sarah Chayes, a former star reporter for National Public Radio in the US, a prize-winning journalist. And again, she's an amazing woman who's written 2 books on corruption. And one of the things she posits is that corruption is the cause of, rather than the result of, global instability, and therefore needs to be rooted out. In other words, it is key to achieving peace. If we want peace, we have to root out corruption wherever it is. Fortunately, there's a lot of discourse going on again in the world at all levels, including at government and leadership levels, so much so that there are concerted efforts afoot to create a global anti-corruption court. It's a recognition of the importance of tackling this root cause of lack of peace in the world. Okay, basic competence. We saw this during COVID, the absence of basic competence in so many parts of the world. So again, I'm not going to belabor the point. Wisdom and justice, which Abdu'l-Baha likens to two mighty banners, which will cause the influence of a government to quickly and easily penetrate the whole earth, even as the light of the sun. Now, the one I do want to focus on is humility. Humility is a key facet of a new ennobling leadership. It's a quality we must demand. It is the foundation of the Baha'i principle of consultation. It's one has to be humble to express one's opinion frankly without fear, but with love and respect, and then to detach one's ego. Without that humility, one cannot detach oneself from one's ego. And so then you'll get the clash of egos rather than opinions, and we won't get the spark of truth. Drawing on the lives of US presidents, Doris Goodwin says humility and listening are two of the 5 most important leadership qualities. Kissinger agrees. In his book, he says humility is a key feature of good leadership. And he uses Konrad Adenauer of Germany again, who was a leader, a chancellor in Germany in the aftermath of the Second World War. He uses him as an example of humility, that he was willing to disavow nationalism and embrace humility in order to submit Germany to the European coal and steel community, so that this European project would be born, and which led to both the economic reconstruction of Europe and its unification. He was also willing to relinquish the dream of German unification that was offered to him by Stalin in 1952, and instead throw his lot in with NATO and the Americans. And so the dream of the reunification of Germany took another 40 years to come to fruition. But Germany benefited because of this decision in so many ways. Another key quality is actively seeking the broadest diversity of input possible. Suffice it to say that, again, there's a lot in the writings about this, but the principle of consultation is the key principle here. And the idea is really that truth is like a gem with different facets, and each of us see the facets in different lights. They present as blue, green, yellow, depending on our vantage point, and that we enhance our collective understanding by sharing these views with each other rather than fighting with each other about which of us is right. A lot has been written and said about this. One of the interesting recent conclusions that The Economist magazine has drawn is that leaders, as they become more autocratic, the range of people they consult with narrows, and the decisions they make end up being less and less effective and actually really poor. And 2 examples of this are President Putin of Russia, who in his increasing isolation during COVID and thereafter apparently allowed himself to be convinced by a small coterie of those surrounding him that he could win the war in Ukraine in a few days. He really believed it, apparently, when he went in. Another example was Prime Minister Modi of India, who announced a policy of demonetization without really conferring with his advisors and others. He made the decision on his own. He believed that he knew what he was doing, and he understood, and he deprived himself of the gift of the maturity of understanding by actually consulting with others, and it has had a lot of negative consequences for the economy in India. The quality that is probably the most important is the willingness and ability to challenge old assumptions and replace them with new ones. I want to give you an analogy. When we are sick, let's say we have a bacterial infection, the steps we have to go through um, to fix the microbiome is to first kill the old bacteria by taking antibiotics and then populate it with good bacteria. So the same thing needs to be done with old assumptions. As Shoghi Effendi says, if old assumptions and rules and laws and institutions are not working for us, we need to relegate them to the heap of obsolescent doctrines rather than sacrificing our happiness just to maintain them. So we need a change of heart, Abdu'l-Baha says, a reframing of all our conceptions, and a new orientation of our activities. Now, look at what Peter Drucker, an Austrian-American management consultant, says in his book, Managing in Turbulent Times. He says the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence itself, but rather acting with yesterday's logic. And Stephen Hines really takes this up. So let's look at some examples of false assumptions. The means justify the ends. Well, no, they don't. And the House of Justice has told us that we must always ensure that the means are as worthy as the ends. Let's look at some false assumptions that Stephen Hines proposes that we change. He says we've got to shift from the notion that peace is an end to war to the notion of what he calls a positive peace, which entails the elimination of violence that stems from social injustice and systemic conditions like hunger, poverty, inequality, racism, etc. So this completely aligns with the Baha'i writings, in which we're told that justice is the indispensable foundation for peace, which in turn will usher in the most great peace and the world civilization which Baha'u'llah has come to bring. Stephen Hines also talks about the idea of shifting from the old assumption of great power dominance to an idea of multinodal power. So moving from unipolar power to multinodal power, and developing what he calls a collaborative global leadership. Another distinguished academic, Dr. Amitav Acharya, says that the current global order is being upended and that it may not be such a bad thing because it could augur a more inclusive world shaped by a global multiplex of countries that would lead to a fairer world. So all of this aligns with everything Shoghi Effendi has also told us in the writings. Kishore Mahbubani says that good leaders have to accept the time has come to make painful U-turns from past assumptions and realities and consider unthinkable options, such as being able to talk to all leaders, whether we view them as good or evil. Kissinger points to Richard Nixon as demonstrating this boldness in smashing the assumptions about China and ending China's isolation. And he points to Anwar Sadat's willingness to break with past assumptions, expel 20,000 Soviet advisors from Egypt, and open the door to negotiations and forge a peace deal with the Israelis at Camp David. Heinz also proposes, following the example of the EU and NATO, to create a pooled or shared collaborative sovereignty, moving to a model of collective governance, collaboration, and collective decision-making, especially when it comes to collective challenges. There are many other things. So he says we need to agree to shared values and principles. That we talked about before. He also says we need to shift from the old assumption of mutually assured destruction to mutually assured survival. We need to get rid of the idea that we have fraudulent democracy and understand that we have a flawed democracy, but a flawed democracy is better than no democracy, and that we can fix the flaws in it. And then the last thing he says, which I love, is that we need to change our global economic model. He says that our pursuit of neoliberal economic policies has rewarded greed and the accumulation of material possessions. Materialism is not the answer, he says. That's the old assumption. We need to move towards a new human and economic global well-being model. And we need to stop conflating materialism with democracy. He says this was the the mistake we made in Russia, offering them a capitalistic economy in the name of democracy. And then they became disillusioned with democracy when they didn't get the results they thought they would get. Last qualities, compassion and empathy. Again, Stephen Hines says we need to shift from a policy of strategic narcissism to strategic empathy, moving from a narrow viewpoint of our own national experience, perceptions, and self-interest to deep listening in relation to others, seeking greater understanding of their views and needs, and investing less effort in persuasion. Interestingly, during COVID, we saw that women leaders were very good at this. Several books have been written on this topic, including books about Jacinda Ardern, who was the Prime Minister of New Zealand at the time, and extolling her virtues of humility, compassion, and empathy. Doris Goodwin also identifies empathy as one of the 5 most important leadership qualities. Okay, so in addition to demanding all these qualities, we also have to interrogate the motivations of would-be leaders and ask what might their selfish purpose be when they want to gain power. This is something Abdu'l-Baha asks us to do. Ask this question: what is their real motive? Why is the leadership shift towards ennobling leadership so important? Because, as Abdu'l-Baha says, we could build the most perfect institutions, but they will be subject to abuse and corruption unless we ensure that their members are endowed with character and qualities that render them fit and worthy. We see glimpses of this future that could be ours in the example set by the custodians of the faithful, the hands of the cause, during the interregnum period after the passing of the Guardian in 1957 and the election of the House of Justice in 1963. It's striking how they were able to bring the Baha'i community along to accept the reality that there would be no heir to the Guardian, contrary to the expectation and desire of the community. To see and accept this reality, forge unity of thought, and maintain cohesion and unity of the body of believers while they did it. Another instructive example is the way the hands of the cause dealt with the internal rebellion instigated by Mason Remy, who was a hand of the cause himself. They dealt with it wisely and in progressive steps, initially remonstrating with him and admonishing him, then exposing him, and finally decisively excommunicating him. Throughout, they were honest and transparent with the Baha'i world, communicating openly and clearly the steps they were taking and why, and thus they were able to bring the community along with them and maintain the unity of the cause of God. In both instances, the hands of the cause took the long view. They were proactive, taking the community where it needed to go, even though it didn't want to be there. In the process, they put aside their own interests and served the interests, the collective interests of the community, and they avoided the temptation of trying to seize power, even as the Ark of the Faith was being buffeted by the storm of severe trials. They recognized that they were there merely to serve and fulfill a function at a particularly sensitive stage in the history of the faith. And as soon as that stage was over, they did something miraculous and unprecedented. They voluntarily and humbly relinquished power. They had no burning ambitions of their own, going so far as to ask not to be elected to the Universal House of Justice. We all owe them a huge debt. Beyond what they did for the cause, their example demonstrates that such kind of ennobling leadership is not a chimera. This is not an idealistic notion. Rather, it is possible, and therefore it induces hope within us. Given everything we've discussed today, we can conclude that a leadership shift towards the model of ennobling leadership will ensure, as Stephen Hines says, that the age of turbulence does not become the age of catastrophe. If you're interested in learning more on this topic, I invite you to pick up a copy of The Alchemy of Peace. That's available on Amazon, and for those of you attending the conference, at the conference bookstore. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to having conversations over time with you on this subject.